I'm not a historian. I'm something called a radical. And it's very interesting when one compares the differences in terms of meaning for radicalism in, say, the 17th century to the 20th century to the 21st century. And I was a teacher. Fortunately, I'm not a teacher any longer, but anybody who's in institutions of education now know there is something called a prevent strategy, which is being enacted. And it is to prevent radicalism. I'm somebody who actually is, and always has been, in favour of the more radical, the better. And, but that's me. The other thing I wanted to say was walking down Bishopsgate to the Bishopsgate Institute, and I came from Shoreditch. I was appalled. 50 years ago, I worked in a school in Spitalfields, and the whole area was of human proportions. When you walk down Bishopsgate today, and particularly towards the city, the things that you see are the manifestations of capital in grotesque proportions. And that a building like this, that certainly 50 years ago was a large building, is now minute. And it just was very significant recognising what has happened in London. All of us know this. But to suddenly come back again into somewhere that is very known to you and see it in a completely different way is really quite shocking. But this is, of course, the stuff of history. On my left is Ted Vallance, who is going to be speaking for the first part of the session. And on my right is Jay Carver, who is going to be speaking for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes each. And I suppose the thing that is a bit strange is trying to work out how, in fact, both of them are sitting on either end of this table. Well, of course, it's about the English Revolution. It's about what one man on my left has been discovering through books and information and pamphlets and other things. And the man on my right has been discovering through both books and pamphlets and other things, but supremely from the work of the archaeologist, somebody who's been doing a lot of delving and digging and mapping. So we'll have, both of them will give their presentations, and then we'll have questions at the end. So, John Lilburne, not my left. Ted.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. My paper is entitled Reborn John, as I'm looking at the 18th in particular, and also a little bit of the 19th century afterlife of John Lilburne. Now, as this great event, I think, makes clear, and thanks to John Rees and the Bishopsgate for putting this together, Lilburne is now the most celebrated of the English radicals of the 17th century. He's been commemorated in popular biography, in television drama, and we're going to hear about The Devil's Whore in another session, and even in rock opera. Of course, we'll also hear from Red Hammer from his Reborn John song cycle. But as I think Mike Granick's paper in the earlier session made clear, this fame in terms of popular history can be contrasted with the growing reservations that academic historians have about the significance of the Levellers, or have had recently. According to a number of historians, most notably Blair Worden in his Roundhead Reputations, the Levellers were actually a group that received virtually no attention from historians until the late 19th and early 20th century, when they gained prominence as a result of the work of liberal, socialist and Marxist scholars. And so to connect it with Jay's paper, as was described on BBC's Making History, we've got a kind of excavation process going on where these forgotten radicals are dug up in the 20th century to be explored by these Marxist and socialist scholars. Now, the one exception to this historical neglect, as Blair Worden has noted, was John Lilburne, who continued to be deemed worthy of attention of biographers and historians through the 18th and 19th centuries. Even so, Worden argues, Lilburne was treated as a fairly minor player and didn't figure very prominently in histories of the Civil Wars. Moreover, Lilburne's relative visibility, in contrast to his associates Richard Overton, John Wildman and William Wallin, had very little to do with connections to something identified as the Leveller movement. Instead, Lilburne was given 18th century labels like enthusiast, meaning religious enthusiast, or patriot. The Levellers, when mentioned at all, were crudely caricatured as social levellers, so people who wanted to do away with distinctions of class and status. And scant attention was paid to the ideas manifested in documents such as the many versions of the Levellers' written constitution, the Agreement of the People. Rather than being remembered as a radical then, Worden argues, Lilburne was memorialised for his many courtroom battles which struck a chord with 18th century legal controversies, especially over freedom of the press. On this reading, it was Lilburne the litigant who was remembered, not Lilburne the leveller. I want to argue instead that Lilburne's case indicates the implication of 17th century figures in 18th century, indicates that the invocation of 17th century figures in 18th century political battles was not simply part of a process of historical reinvention. As I hope to show, in the case of early 18th century historical treatments of the Civil Wars, there was actually considerable effort made to represent Lilburne's life and ideas accurately. Indeed, Lilburne's memory had an enduring power precisely because of the element of continuity, both in the ideals at stake and in how they were contested, so the continuity between 17th and 18th century radicalism. And it was just because these ideals remained radical, whatever the problems with using that term, that there was no need for historians unsympathetic to Lilburne and the Levellers to distort their aims. They could just as easily condemn these groups by rehearsing their actual political principles, which remained anathema for many. Paradoxically, though, as Lilburne's public profile grew over the second half of the 18th century, so awareness of the broader aspects of his life and career appeared to diminish, including his connection with the Levellers. But I would argue this decreasing emphasis on Lilburne as leveller didn't equate to the severing of Lilburne's public memory from radical politics. Rather, in the later 18th century, Lilburne became ever more closely identified with contemporary radicals, from John Wilkes to John Horne, later Horne Tooke, to Charles James Fox. The parallel ensured that he remained a contentious, ambiguous figure, a radical hero for some, a demagogic anti-hero to others. The affinity these figures and their supporters felt for Lilburne again reflected similarities of style, the emphasis on charismatic personality, the use of the courtroom as political theatre, and of ideals, individual liberty, freedom of the press, and the importance of the jury system. But Lilburne's memory did not simply legitimate arguments in support of these concepts and institutions. More than this, his legal struggles exerted a tangible influence on British law, helping to change legislation relating to libel, the power of juries, and even the legal status of slaves on British soil. Now, as we've heard in the earlier sessions, and as the work of historians such as Mike Braddock, Rachel Foxley, and Jason Pesey have shown us, Lilburne was one of the most written about individuals of the 1640s, and the subject of sophisticated propaganda campaigns, both hostile and positive. Indeed, Lilburne's fame was such that Mike Braddock has christened him the celebrity radical, and celebrity is a kind of popular academic topic now in the historiography. One scholar, Simon Morgan, has described celebrity as being, quote, a known individual who has become a marketable commodity. Lilburne was certainly monetised. His name alone sold books, even when he didn't write or appear in them, and his face graced a number of prints and medallions, including the one that's on your leaflet, in the same way that in the 18th century, Wilkes and his campaign were commodified and personalised. And of course, we're doing that again today. You can go and get your t-shirt in the Great Hall. I'll be going a bit later. So one of the things that we have to do before we move on to talk about the 18th century reputation of Lilburne is understand what this representation in his own lifetime amounted to. What's strikingly absent from the earliest portrayals of Lilburne is any strong connection between him and political radicalism, between him and something called the Leveller movement. Now, there's a practical reason for that. It's not until late in 1647, after the party debates, that this label gets attached to these political figures. Instead, in the mid-1640s, to use the phrase of Thomas Edwards, the notorious Presbyterian heresiographer, cataloguer of heretical and sectarian groups, Lilburne was, quote, the great darling of the sectaries. For Edwards, then, Lilburne was a new Thomas Müntzer, or John of Leyden, who was seen as representing the worst excesses of the popular Reformation in Germany. He was being presented here as the messianic leader of religious fanatics, not the director of a political movement. This was an image which persisted even after the label Leveller became common. Another of Lilburne's hostile biographers, the Presbyterian Cuthbert Sydenham, claimed that it was de facto toleration which had fueled the growth of the Leveller movement. He said that all that turn Levellers first leave the principles of scripture religion, that they may be without check of conscience for any civil disorder. A mock glass wooden testament produced in 1654, as Lilburne languished in prison in Jersey, continued to harp on this theme. It depicted this erstwhile sectary leaving his lips to, quote, the saints of the feminine, and the will itself was presented as being dictated to, quote, Sister Abigail Lemon, and since published by Ruth Docks. And for any of you who know about the slang in the 17th century, these women's names are allusions to prostitutes. Hostile presentations of Lilburne often portrayed him and his followers of being of the meaner sort. In Edwards' words, he was that, quote, unworthy, mean man. This could be linked again to social levelling and thereby to the kind of misrepresentations of Levellerism noted by Worden. But it was also a way of knocking Lilburne's own pretensions, notably his insistence on the ancient pedigree of the Lilburne family and his acquisition of gentlemanly manners and dress, again harking back to that rather fine portrait on the programme. Similarly, Sydenham described the Levellers as being mechanic, plebeian, vulgar and coarse, and depicted Lilburne as, quote, a man of such inconsiderable interest, one who could hardly ever challenge more land in England than might geometrically serve to make his grave. And this is again a political argument, where political representation is connected to the ownership of property. By arguing that these men are of the meaner sort, it's arguing that they have no stake in the political nation. Now, one of the most enduring tropes in anti-Lilburne propaganda, as Mike Braddock has mentioned, was the image of him as the source of all contention. Quarrelsome behaviour in general came to be described as, quote, to play Lilburne. Death itself, it was suggested, would not bring an end to Lilburne's mania for controversy. A mock will ordered that his body be embalmed and his coffin encased in a double sheath of lead, quote, lest it cause either mutinying creatures or earthquakes, end quote. The theme was returned to in the famous epitaph produced following Lilburne's death. Is John departed, and is Lilburne gone? Farewell to both, to Lilburne and to John. But lay John here, lay Lilburne hereabout, for if they ever meet, they will fall out. These three elements in contemporary portraits of Lilburne, that he was a sectary, that he had a seemingly insatiable appetite for controversy, and that he was of a lowly status, all proved enduring. But even as Edwards moved from attacking religious radicalism to targeting the army and political independence, to attacking political radicalism basically, he seems to have felt no need to present Lilburne as, quote, a social leveller. Instead, he attacked Lilburne and his associates on the grounds that they sought to, quote, overthrow the three estates and the laws of the kingdom, and in the stead of the fundamental government laws and constitution of this kingdom, set up an utopian anarchy of the promiscuous multitude. So the line of attack here remains about the political ideas, not any kind of social agenda on behalf of the Leveller movement. Instead, much more was made of Lilburne's connections with royalists than of his collusion with radical elements in the army or links with fellow political travellers such as Richard Overton, and Jason Pesey has just spoken about this. In part, this was a parliamentarian response to the treatment of Lilburne's imprisonments in the royalist press, where his case was shown as an example of the increasingly tyrannical rule of the army junta, as it was known. The parliamentarian press responded in turn by depicting Lilburne as a royalist plotter, colluding in the Tower with the Welsh judge David Jenkins. In 1649, these rumours even became an occasion for humour, when the newsletter Mercurius Atlanticus reported that Lilburne's jailers had been ordered to keep him under close watch, as his cell windows in the Tower faced those of the royalist Countess of Carlisle, Lucy Hay. It was feared, the newsletter reported, that, quote, though the distance be very great, the two might enter into communication via sign language, which might be, quote, very prejudicial to the present government. The connections established between Lilburne and the royalist cause, as I'll show, proved of lasting significance for his subsequent reputation. These unlikely alliances became part of the dispute about the accuracy and objectivity of the greatest post-Restoration narrative of the Civil Wars, produced by Edward Hyde, Earl of Clarendon, his History of the Rebellion, published posthumously in 1702. So to talk about Clarendon's history. Clarendon's history took a rather different take on the Levellers than many other post-Restoration histories of the Civil Wars. He delivered a more complex and at points conflicting reading of Lilburne and the Levellers. Some elements of this story chime with familiar denunciations of other royalists. Clarendon described Lilburne along with Overton as a fanatic and argued that in general the Levellers had held, quote, great malice against the king. But in Book 14 of his history, Clarendon delivered a much more extensive discussion of Lilburne in the context of talking about royalist conspiracies against the Protectorate. Clarendon's treatment here extends over several pages, running from his emergence as a martyr for the Puritan cause in the late 1630s through to his career in the parliamentarian army and on to his engagement with radical politics. Elements of the established picture remained. Lilburne was described as being, quote, a poor bookbinder. But the purpose in rehearsing Lilburne's biography for Clarendon was rather different from that of most Restoration historians. For Clarendon, the case of both Lilburne and John Wildman represented evidence, however strained, of, quote, the temper of the nation, and how far the spirits of that time, 1650s, were from paying submission to that power, the Protectorate, when nobody had the courage to lift up their hands against it. So for Clarendon, Lilburne and Wildman are in some ways part of the side of good in resisting the tyranny of the Cromwellian Protectorate. Now this account was based, unlike a lot of the accounts of royalist historians, on personal knowledge. Clarendon had actually been in discussions with Levellers about potential alliances, although, as Jason said, the extent of these alliances is probably exaggerated in the contemporary press. As noted by other historians, the historiography of the 18th century was dominated by party politics. And this wasn't just about the perspective of the authors themselves, but the marketing of works of history, which were dependent upon subscriptions from wealthy political activists. History, some argue, therefore suffered as a result. And Clarendon's history, after an initially very kind of rapturous response to its publication, was one of those works singled out as being unreliable and partisan, partly as a result of a blatantly Tory preface attached to the later volumes by Clarendon's son, the Earl of Rochester. One of these critiques of Clarendon's work was provided in Volume 5 of the Biographica Britannica, edited by William Oldys and published in 1760, which contained a lengthy biography of Lilburne. The author of this biography, Philip Nichols, said that it would serve, quote, as a partial commentary on Clarendon's history of the rebellion. In doing this, Nichols provided the most detailed to date biography of Lilburne, based uniquely on a close reading of Lilburne's own works, as well as other available printed Civil War sources. And here we can see Oldys' editorial influence. Oldys was the editor of the Harleian collection of rare pamphlets, and described pamphlets as being, quote, the thermometers of state for showing the temperature and changes of government. This use of Lilburne's writings highlighted factual errors in Clarendon's account, that Lilburne was not a poor bookbinder, but came from a gentry family, that he had not died in prison, but was on parole at the end of his life. And he also took issue with the presentation of Lilburne as a unauthorised conspirator. There was always, Nichols said, a mental reservation present in any statements Lilburne made in favour of monarchy. Moreover, even though Nichols' editorial interventions indicated he was not entirely sympathetic to his subject, he referred to Lilburne's supreme vanity, he also engaged thoughtfully with the Levellers' political programme in the Agreement of the People, describing it, albeit with faint praise, as, quote, not being an ill-digested plan for settlement. Now, Nichols explicitly linked Lilburne with the Leveller movement, describing him as its choreophiles, meaning the leader of the group. And what I think is really telling is neither he nor the editor of the Biographica Britannica felt the need to have any other explanation over who these Levellers were. I'm going to return to that point, that one of the ways in which the Levellers are perhaps not discussed in great detail has less to do with them being forgotten, but actually to do with them being in some ways over-familiar, not worthy of comment. Now, the accuracy with which Nichols presented Lilburne's ideas, I think reflects more broadly on early 18th century historiography. The reason why it was possible to represent this group and Lilburne in this way was because of the party political nature of 18th century historiography. The Levellers didn't fit into that Whig and Tory dichotomy, and so neither side could really bend them to this particular model, whether Tory or whether Whig. And in fact, the only historian we can really see embracing the Levellers as worthy political ancestors in the 18th century is the self-confessed Republican Catherine Macaulay. If the presentation of the Lilburne and Levellers by Whig and Tory historians was often impressively accurate, in part because they were actually arguing with Clarendon in many cases and trying to show up his historical inaccuracy, they were scarcely sympathetic portraits. Lilburne was treated as a figure of some historical significance, but he was certainly not portrayed as a heroic figure. It was not until the second half of the 18th century, in Joseph Tower's British biography, published 1766 to 1772, that a straightforwardly positive representation of Lilburne emerged. Tower's biography of Lilburne was clearly built upon the Biographica Britannica, but although he used some different sources, he was clearly making use of Nichols' biography in terms of phrasing and quotation. However, his portrait diverged from the predecessor in two significant ways. First, he removed that reference to the Levellers. There's no connection here between Lilburne and this group anymore. And second, in place of Nichols' heavily annotated text, he produced a smooth-flowing and glowing account of Lilburne's life, describing his subject as, quote, an undaunted spirit, in his private life irreproachable, and attracted to the cause of liberty to a degree even of enthusiasm. So, at the very same time as Lilburne's own character was being rehabilitated, his connection to the Leveller movement was being obscured. The main reason for this, as Word has noted, is the connection between 18th century courtroom struggles over the freedom of the press and Lilburne's seemingly equivalent disputes in the 17th century. These came most to the fore in the notorious North Britain case of 1763, when the radical John Wilkes was accused of libeling George III in his issue 45. The comparison was so keenly felt that in June 1763, Wilkes was even presented with a copy of Lilburne's 1649 trial and the medallion commemorating it. It's worth noting as well that Lilburne was actually compared to Wilkes before this particular trial. The allusion was made so frequently in the Wilkes-like press that one loyalist author complained that reading the writings of Wilkes supporters, one would think Lord Bute was also accountable for the treatment of Lilburne by Star Chamber over a century earlier. Consequently, as much as supporters of freedom of the press identified Lilburne as a worthy predecessor, the affinity suggested between him and Wilkes was also used to attack the Wilkes-like cause. One anti-Wilkes satire, an epistle from Colonel John Lilburne in The Shades to John Wilkes Esquire, probably published in 1765, imagined Lilburne corresponding to Wilkes from hell. The satire pictured Lilburne and his radical associates toasting Wilkes in the underworld. "You are become so much my favourite," Lilburne says, "that whenever I go to a tavern to drink a bottle with a friend, the first toast I give is to Wilkes and Liberty." So Lilburne's public commemoration in the later 18th century continued to reveal a character whose attributes were highly contested. To compare a contemporary figure with him was to make a political statement. Lilburne continued to be used as a byword for contentiousness and rabble-rousing. At the same time, advocates of political reform were also presented in the press as ancestors of John Lilburne. This was not simply a case, though, I would say, of 18th century reformers searching for convenient historical predecessors. The invocation of Lilburne reflected the continuing importance of the law to late 18th century radicalism. The arguments voiced by Lilburne at his 1649 trial had real impact on the law, and by extension the role of juries. Allusions to Lilburne's legal struggles persisted into the era of more self-conscious radicalism in the 1790s. In a speech given in Parliament on the 20th of May 1791, Charles James Fox compared the contemporary libel case involving John Luxford, printer of the Morning Herald, with that of Lilburne in 1649, with the qualification that while he agreed with Lilburne that juries were sometimes required to be judges of law as well as fact, he did not endorse Lilburne's vitriolic attack on the judiciary. And this speech has legislative significance because it led to the 1792 Libel Act, also known as Fox's Act, legislation that continues to govern libel law today. Perhaps the most dramatic, though, invocation of Lilburne in a legal case was in the 1772 Somerset case, which some of you might be aware of. Somerset was the slave of a Scottish merchant and senior colonial customs official, Charles Stewart. Somerset left his master's service while Stewart was on a visit to London, but was recaptured 2 months later and kept in captivity. The case, often seen as a landmark in the history of the abolition of the slave trade, hinged on whether a writ of habeas corpus which had been made to free Somerset could apply to a slave. One of the lawyers supporting the writ, Francis Hargrave, employed an obscure 16th century precedent, Cartwright's case, to demonstrate that, quote, England was too pure an air for a slave to breathe in. The significant thing, however, is that the only reference for this case came in the arguments of Lilburne's lawyers, the future regicides John Cook and John Bradshaw, as they sought compensation for their client from Parliament in 1645 to 1646. Now, some of you may know, Lord Chief Justice Manfield's verdict in the case was actually probably rather more limited. He did find in favour of Somerset, but he was essentially only affirming that a writ of habeas corpus might apply to a slave. But the decision was widely read as rendering slavery incompatible with English law. Lilburne's rhetoric then of the freeborn Englishman had been extended dramatically. Lilburne was now being celebrated not just as a litigant, but as a liberator. So Lilburne continued to be seen as a martyr to liberty in the broadest sense, not merely as a defender of the liberty of the press or even the rights of juries. He was a figure who was most often invoked positively by 18th century reformers and radicals like Wilkes and Fox. The above suggests that Lilburne continued to define opinion. Loyalists could still cite him as a dangerous mob demagogue, while a variety of reformers, from comparative moderates such as Charles James Fox to self-identified Republican atheists such as Richard Carlile, could treat him as an illustrious predecessor. I know I've been talking for a long time, so I'm going to bring this to a conclusion. For those who are familiar with the 19th century reputation of Oliver Cromwell, there seems to be a comparative drop in the reputation of Lilburne in this century, perhaps reflected by Cromwell's great historian Thomas Carlyle, who described Lilburne merely as noisy John, an irritating gnat who was perpetually bothering the great man, Cromwell. This Victorian cult of Cromwell, I think, only goes some way, though, to explain why Lilburne's reputation diminished in the 19th century. A more convincing explanation could be found in the increasing politicised uses of Lilburne's life in the second half of that century. This Lilburne was invoked in controversies over the freedom of the press, the power of juries, and even the rights of slaves. So one reason why Lilburne's star dimmed, perhaps, was because Lilburne diminished or even completely obscured obscured his connections with the broader context of mid-17th century radicalism. But the focus on Lilburne as an individual did not involve a significant distortion of his self-presentation in the 17th century, which had concentrated heavily on his personal struggles. Equally, the causes in which Lilburne's name was later invoked were all ones that connected with his own political philosophy, the rights of juries, the importance of a free press, and even the incompatibility of slavery with the rights of freeborn Englishmen. In emphasising the separateness of historical epochs, then, historians have arguably undervalued the degree of intellectual sympathy and continuity between the radicalism of the 17th century and that of the 18th. And indeed, Fred Donnelly has recently suggested that over-familiarity rather than ignorance might explain why at least one 18th century revolutionary, Thomas Jefferson, didn't refer to the arguments of his famous ancestor, John Lilburne. As John Rees has also noted, in the mid-19th century, both Marx and Engels identified the Levellers as ancestors of the proletariat, and they surely would not have alighted upon the movement if it had truly sunk into obscurity. We do not need then to invest in a grand narrative of an English radical tradition to acknowledge that the English Revolution of the 17th century had both intellectual and practical consequences for the 18th century. A life which had ended in political retreat in Eltham in 1657 was resurrected in the 18th century to take up the temporal sword once more. Thank you.